talked back on the talkback cards, and we heard you. Within the past few months, you've asked some big questions. Why does God create people with mental illnesses? Why do so many people do good with bad results or do bad and are constantly blessed? If God is love and God is good, then why does a good God allow suffering? You talked back, and actually, God heard you. Before you even asked the questions, almost a year ago, God led our worship planners to do a series on the minor prophets. And somehow, I don't even remember how, we decided on the book of Habakkuk, which answers your questions directly that you've asked in the last month. Habakkuk has the same kind of questions. Adam introduced them last week. Why is there so much injustice in the world? How can God allow evil people to prosper while good people suffer? Where is the God who's supposed to protect us and take care of us? Where is the justice in this messed up world? Even a prophet has doubts and questions. Maybe it's the prophets especially who have doubts and questions. Maybe they're the honest ones who actually say what we're all thinking and feeling. Okay, it's time for you to get a little prophetic. In your bulletin, there are these black pieces of paper. Adam has more paper if you didn't get one, and he'll be passing them out. If you need a pen, he has a box of pens. He'll give you one. Just let him know what you need. All the worship team needs them. So here's what we're going to do with these. On this black piece of paper, write down your biggest doubts, your biggest questions about our world, about the injustices of our world. What bothers you most about our world? When you think about the global situation or your present life situation, what makes you really angry? What is so hard for you to understand? And then just write it down. Now, I'm not going to ask you to read it to anyone or to talk to anyone about what you wrote down. In fact, we chose black so that nobody will be able to read what you wrote. Not even your neighbor or your spouse or your friend sitting next to you. Nobody will see it. So go ahead and use all caps. Use exclamation points and underline it. Curse if you want to. It doesn't matter. Nobody will see. Just be completely honest about whatever it is you're angry about or frustrated about. All right, I'll give you a few minutes to write. I'll write as well. Okay, now hold on to that paper and that doubt for a few minutes. You can keep writing if you want to. We're going to turn to Habakkuk. Habakkuk asked God his questions. He actually probably shouted at God when you read the text. I don't think Hebrew has exclamation points or capital letters, but I think it would be all caps and exclamation points if they had those. And God answered. Today we're going to read Habakkuk 2, which is a full chapter of God's answer to Habakkuk. It's the longest answer in the book. It's a full third of the book of Habakkuk. And we'll start where Adam left off last week in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. I will climb up to my watchtower, this is Habakkuk speaking, and stand at my guard post. There I will wait to see what the Lord says and how he will answer my complaint. Then the Lord said to me, write my answer plainly on tablets, so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. This vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not be delayed. Look at the proud. They trust in themselves, and their lives are crooked. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. Wealth is treacherous, dangerous, and the arrogant are never at rest. They open their mouths as wide as the grave, and like death, they are never satisfied. In their greed, they have gathered up many nations and swallowed many peoples. But soon, their captives will taunt them. They will mock them, saying, what sorrow awaits you, thieves? Now you will get what you deserve. You become rich by extortion. But how much longer can this go on? Suddenly your debtors will take action. They will turn on you and take all you have, while you stand trembling and helpless. Because you have plundered many nations, now all the survivors will plunder you. You committed murder throughout the countryside and filled the towns with violence. What sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly? You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger. But by the murders you committed, you have shamed your name and forfeited your lives. The very stones in the walls cry out against you, and the beams in the ceilings echo the complaint. What sorrow awaits you who build cities with money gained through murder and corruption? Has not the Lord of Heaven's armies promised that the wealth of nations will turn to ashes? They work so hard, but in vain. For as the waters fill the sea, the earth will be filled with the awareness of the glory of God. What sorrow awaits you who make your neighbors drunk? You force your cup on them so you can gloat over their shameful nakedness. But soon it will be your turn to be disgraced. Come and drink and be exposed. Drink from the cup of the Lord's judgment, and all your glory will turn to shame. You cut down the forests of Lebanon. Now you will be cut down. You destroyed the wild animals, so now their terror will be yours. You committed murder throughout the countryside and filled the towns with violence. What good is an idol carved by man, or a cast image that deceives you? How foolish it is to trust your own creation, a God that can't even talk. What sorrow awaits you who say to wooden idols, wake up and save us. To speechless stone images you say, rise up and teach us. Can an idol tell you what to do? They may be overlaid with gold and silver, but they are lifeless inside. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Church, this is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. questions and doubts. There's no way around that. Life is confusing and difficult and wonderful, and our world is broken and bruised and beautiful. In Habakkuk 2, God answers Habakkuk's questions, but right from the beginning, God tells us that his answer isn't just for Habakkuk personally, but he's supposed to write it down so that he can tell others. We now are some of the others who are hearing God's answers because Habakkuk wrote it down. In Habakkuk 2, I think God is telling us 3 things about our doubts and frustrations. First, trust that God is just. Second, why we should trust that God is just. And third, what happens when we trust that God is just. So let's start with the first one. Trust that God is just. I mean, one of the hardest questions of faith is how can a good and loving God allow so much injustice in our world? God's first answer is, look toward the end. He says in verse 3, this vision is for a future time. It describes the end and it will be fulfilled. Now the Hebrew here in this sentence, in this verse, is more like this vision pants toward the end. God's vision and God's plan is steadily jogging forward, panting, breathing quickly, moving to the finish line, and you can be sure that God will get there. God will accomplish his plans for the universe. That is a guarantee. Then God says, if it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not delay. God may seem slow. In fact, I can just about guarantee you there will be a time in your life when God seems slow. We may wonder, what on earth is taking so long? But God is not late. It may not be our timing. It may not match our understanding. It may not be when or how we would do it if we were God, but God is not late. His timing is perfect. Next, God explains that the only alternative to trusting God is trusting ourselves. And that just messes us up. Verse 4, look at the proud. They trust in themselves. They are crooked. When we turn our hope to our own strength, it bends us the wrong way. Wealth is treacherous, dangerous, and they are never satisfied. If we trust in money and power, our lives become these crooked distortions of what we're supposed to be. We get all bent in on ourselves in this black hole of emptiness. We try to get bigger and bigger to fill the hole, but instead, we just get emptier and emptier. And then, next, we get one of the most famous verses of the Bible. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. Now, many of us probably remember this in its older version. But the just shall live by faith. Paul quoted this verse as a summary of the gospel in his letter to the Romans. This good news tells how God makes us right in his sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by faith. As the scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. But the just will live by faith. And our epistle lesson from Hebrews 10 also quoted this verse. What does this so important verse that is quoted in the New Testament mean? The just shall live by faith. Okay, so first let's look at the subject. The just, the righteous, those who do right, those who live right, those who get life right. And then next, the modifier at the end, by faith. Actually, that has a meaning of steadfast trust. The word for faith here isn't kind of intellectual belief, a list of beliefs that we can check off. I believe in the Trinity. Check. I believe in salvation by grace through faith. check. Okay, I'm in. I've got the faith thing down. This is a heart-level trust. This is about being steadfast or steady in the midst of storm and trouble. Even when the wind is blowing and the leaves and the branches are moving like crazy, the roots are firm and solid. That is steadfast trust. And last, look at the verb, will live or shall live. If you want to get life right, then live with steadfast trust. Steady trust in God straightens out our lives. Steady trust in God keeps us rooted in truth and goodness. Steady trust in God keeps us connected to the source of life. So in the midst of all the frustrations and struggles and injustices of God, trust that God is going to bring justice in the end. Trust that God is just. God will not let evil go unpunished or good go unrewarded. God is just. Trust him. Trust that God is just and will make everything right in the end. That's the first big point. Trust that God is just. Okay, so God's next big point in chapter 2 is why we should trust that God is just. And the answer is pretty simple. If you sum it up, it's a common English phrase. What comes around goes around. So let's take a minute and unpack some of the Hebrew text here. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever tried to translate poetry? Or have you ever read translated poetry? I mean, you all have, because lots of the Bible is poetry. But if you look at translated poetry, it's really hard to keep it beautiful. It just doesn't work. Or have you ever tried to translate a joke? It doesn't work most of the time. What works in one language doesn't necessarily work in another language. And that seems to be what's happening here. Apparently, the scholars say Habakkuk was one of the greatest Hebrew poets ever. Seriously. Who knew? Habakkuk? Honest, I had to look at the table of contents to find Habakkuk, even though, we're preaching on this. There are poetic devices all over the place in chapter 2. Every single verse is just chock full of them. And Habakkuk's 3 favorite techniques are rhyming, parallelism, and wordplay. Okay, we all know what rhyming is. That's basic poetry, where you make the words in the line sound the same. Parallelism is an extremely common thing in Hebrew poetry. It's where you say one thing in one line, and then in the next line you say the same thing in a different way. But wordplay is really hard to translate. For example, in verse 18, Habakkuk says, "Idols are speechless nothings." In Hebrew, this is Elalim, Ilamim, speechless nothings. In English, we might get close to what this means by saying idols are dumb dummies. They're dumb and they're dumb. They're dumb, stupid, and they're dumb, they can't talk. But in Hebrew, there's another layer of wordplay because the word for God is Elohim. So, idols are Elalim, Ilalim, which sounds like Elohim. Idols may sound like God. They may even look like what we hope for in a God, but they are counterfeits. They are fakes. They are really dumb, dummy nothings. Then in verse 6, God says, the poor people will turn on the rich and revolt and mock them with sayings. I know our translation says they will mock them saying, and then it just gives a long line of quotes. But the Hebrew is actually, they will mock them with sayings or proverbs. They will shout these proverbs at them mockingly. And everywhere in the text where it says, woe to those, in the Hebrew it's more like, ha! And then it says a proverb. Okay, so what I want to try to do here is give a rough translation and summary of these 5 rather long proverbs, put them into short English proverbs or sayings to help us feel some of what the Israelites would have felt. So verse 6 and 8 might be translated roughly, live by the sword, die by the sword. Do evil, get evil. Just you wait. Then verses 9 to 11 might be something like, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. You think your big house will protect you? Just wait until it comes crashing down around your head. Then verses 12 and 13, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders build in vain. Now that's actually from the Bible, Psalm 127. Do it without God and you're just building an empty shell. Then verses 15 and 7 through 17, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Do unto others and it will be done unto you. Then verses 18 and 19, this one's my own invention. I have to be honest to our non-native English speakers, not a famous proverb. I just made this up because it seems to fit. See how you like it. Idols are all bling and no being. All flash and glitter, but no substance. Terry doesn't like it. Maybe that one's not meant for your generation, Terry. Sorry. You know bling? All right. Basically, idols are gold-plated nothings. All right, like the chocolate Easter bunnies. They look so cool, and then you bite into them, and it's just the shell. All right, that's what an idol is. Basically, God is saying, look, Habakkuk, look, Israel, look, people of all time. I know you can't always see how life works out. I know that in the short term, this world can look really unjust. I get it. I understand. I know. But what you've got to remember is that what comes around goes around. Everyone is going to get their just desserts in the end. And no, that doesn't mean we're all going to get ice cream at the end of the day. We get all our just desserts. It means that everyone will get what they deserve. It means at the end of time, we are all going to agree that God is fair. Sometimes justice comes rolling down like a river in this lifetime. Like Martin Luther King said, quoting Amos, let justice roll like a mighty river. And we see dictators like Saddam or Gaddafi dragged through the streets. But other times, justice has to wait for the end time. All God is asking is that we believe that God is just and that God will make justice happen eventually. Real justice. Justice that everyone will say is just. God's timing may not be our timing, but it works. It works even better than our timing. What comes around goes around because God is just. Then lastly, there are 2 little verses that are almost hidden in this text that give us a picture of what actually happens when we trust that God is just. The first one is verse 14. For as the waters fill the sea, the earth will be filled with an awareness of the glory of God. Now, this may seem pretty, but not so impressive at first. But remember what God said about those idols. They may be overlaid with gold or silver, but they are lifeless inside. They are empty. There is nothing inside. And think back to how God described at the beginning of the chapter the people who are addicted to money. They open their mouths as wide as the grave, and like death, they are never satisfied. They never get full. They keep putting more and more in, but they are just black holes. They are always empty. They can never get enough. And the people who build their cities through violence and corruption, their wealth will turn to ashes. Their glory will turn to shame. They work so hard, but it is all in vain. Their lives are empty. Their wealth is empty. Their work is empty. It is all empty. But the time will come when God's glory will fill the earth. Fill the earth like the waters fill the sea. Now just stop and think about that. How much do the waters fill the sea, the ocean? How full is the ocean of water? The waters saturate the ocean. Every inch, every nanometer of the sea is drenched in water. It is completely soaked in water. One day, everyone and everything everywhere will be full with the glory of God. John gives us a picture of this in the Revelation, in his vision of heaven and the redeemed earth. And the city, the heavenly city, has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb is its light, and the nations walk in its light. God's glory will be so thick and obvious that it will just light up everything, and we will walk around like we're walking inside the sun. God's glory will fill every empty space in our lives. Every place where we feel that God is absent, every place where there is a lack, God will eliminate all of the injustices, all of the sadness, all of the suffering, all of the longing, all of the desperate dissatisfaction that pushes us for more and more and more to fill our emptiness. We will all be full of God's glory and goodness. Okay, and the last verse that I want to talk about is the last verse. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Habakkuk started out shouting, "Why, God? How long, God? It's not fair, God. How can you do this, God?" And amazingly, God was okay with that. God was okay with the shouting and the venting and the accusations. Think about Job, the most famous sufferer of all time. Job spent something like 30 chapters arguing with God and his friends. Job famously rails against God. Things that we would say meant that he had rejected God or had no faith in God. He said, "What did I ever do to you, God, that you're punishing me? God might kill me, but I will argue my case against him. God hates me. God has wronged me. God is not fair. My complaint is with God." And yet, even though he says all of these things, he continues shouting and screaming, believing that God will eventually hear him and answer him. Somehow, even though he is so mad, he believes that the good God must eventually prove himself good. And finally, God does answer Job from inside a whirlwind or a tornado. God says, "Job, you're right about some of that. It's okay to feel like that. And you have a good heart. But also, you don't know everything. Did you make the world? Did you put the stars in place? Did you design DNA or engineer gravity? No? Then shut up." And overwhelmed by God's glory and power, Job says, "I cover my mouth with my hand, for I have been speaking about things that are far too wonderful for me." Habakkuk comes to a similar place. Overwhelmed with the glory of God that will fill the earth, Habakkuk echoes God's voice. Let all the earth be silent before the Lord. Habakkuk moves from shouting to silence, from anger to awe, from wrestling with God to resting in the mystery of God. God is God, not us. God is God, and God is just. If we really believe that, then we can shout all we want to, but eventually we need to come to a place of silent worship before the awesome Creator and Master of the universe. We need to get to the place that we trust that God knows how to be God. Okay, imagine with me that you're riding in a Jeep through the jungle with an experienced guide, an Indiana Jones type guide. And as you travel over these jungle-covered mountains, it is raining so hard that the dirt roads are little more than muddy rivers. You can see almost nothing, but you can feel every bump and every turn in the center of your gut. And every so often, your view clears enough so that you can see a bank of trees coming right at you, but somehow the driver suddenly turns and misses the trees. And once or twice, when you were going around a turn, you looked out and saw nothing but miles and miles of air, and you thought, this is it. We're all going to die. We're going over the edge. But somehow, miraculously, Indiana Jones guy kept the Jeep on the road, and you continued going. Now you can shout, look out! Slow down! Be careful! Do you even know where we're going? Can you see anything? We're all going to die! But eventually, Indiana Jones is going to turn to you and say, do you want to drive? Harrison Ford, in his unshaven face, will look you in the eye and say, do you want to walk? And then we have a choice. Do you trust the driver more than yourself? If you don't, you can get out and walk, or you can try to take the wheel. But if you trust the driver, then the best thing to do is just sit there and trust. When our life's journey has bumps and turns and jungles and rainstorms, we face the same situation. And God is kind of like our Indiana Jones. We can be really frustrated about it all. It may not feel safe or fair or necessary. But in the end, we face the same basic question. Do we trust the driver? Do we trust that God will bring our world where it is supposed to go? Do we trust that God will eventually be fair with everyone and everything? Because unless we want to drive our world, or unless we want to get out and walk, eventually our only choice is to sit in silent, worshipful trust that God is just. Okay, get out that black paper again. We're going to pray, and then we're going to take communion. But when we take communion, we're going to do something different. We'll take our biggest, blackest doubts and hand them over to God. So take the paper and roll it up or fold it up, and remember the doubt that you've written on it. And when you come up for communion, you can just slip it here in the cross. We're going to take our doubts and give them to God. Entrust them to Jesus. We have doubts. We have questions. We have emptiness inside, and they're big. Trust that God is bigger than your doubts. Trust that God is bigger than your questions. Give your doubt to God